Welcome to the Christian Woman Leadership Podcast, where we hope to inspire you to embrace your God-given gifts, skills, and passions in order to lead with confidence. We want you to remember that you are fearfully and wonderfully made in the image of God, and you are fully loved by Him.
You have been designed on purpose by God with unique gifts and passions in order to love and lead those around you. I'm your host, Esther Littlefield, a pastor's wife, business owner, mom, and writer.
And I'm Esther's co-host, Holly Kane. I'm a wife, mom, and business owner. I also write at hollykane.org, where I focus on my passion for women's ministry.
Together, we chat about important issues that Christian women leaders face. In addition, we interview other women just like you who lead in various roles, from church to community to business. Through this podcast, we offer you encouragement, tools, and resources to help you on your leadership journey. We are so glad you're here with us. Hi, friend, and welcome to episode 87 of the podcast. Today, I am here with you solo, and I want to continue our Simplify series and chat with you about the issue of self-care. Specifically, I'd like to help you simplify your self-care. As a leader, you have a lot going on, and the last thing you need is some kind of complicated or super long process for self-care. But first, I want to identify and address the elephant in the room. Some people, especially Christians, don't like the term self-care. They feel it implies being selfish or focusing on loving yourself. I've had people take issue with me and with some of the things I have shared around this topic. So I want to clear the air right off the bat and identify what I mean by self-care and why I think it's a valid thing for us to do as Christians. All right, so I'm going to start with a couple passages of scripture. First one is 1 Corinthians 6:19 through 20. It says this, "Or do you not know that your body is a temple of the Holy Spirit within you, whom you have from God? You are not your own, for you were bought with a price. So glorify God in your body." The second passage is Mark 12:30 through 31. "And you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind and with all your strength." The second is this, "You shall love your neighbor as yourself. There is no other commandment greater than these." So when you think about self-care, there's two principles I think that we can take from these passages. The first one is that self-care is a way of honoring and loving God. By taking care of our body, the thing that God has given us, and our minds, and our hearts, our spirits, we are better able to love and honor God. He's given this to us, this one life that we have to live here on earth, and it's our responsibility to care for what He's given us. And then secondly, we are better able to care for and love other people when we take care of ourselves. So if we actually neglect ourselves in terms of the basics of self-care, caring for our mind, caring for our spirit, caring for our bodies, then we actually do a disservice to other people and to God, because we are less able to care for others if we are burnt out, if we are completely spent, if we have no energy left to give. So we can see that God built in self-care, in a sense, through creating a day of rest. And He established the principle of Sabbath. And we've actually talked about this with some of our guests on the podcast in the past. But this idea is invented by God, not by us. And I think that He knew we would need rest from all the things we are doing. And I believe that rest is part of self-care, having that built in, that one day a week that is not meant to be where we are constantly working and overcommitting ourselves. We also can look at Jesus and how He lived His life here on earth. And we see that He took times to be alone, to go and pray, to be with the Father. And you might not consider that self-care. Most of us don't look at that and say, well, Jesus was doing self-care. But in my mind, that is part of what He was doing to take care of His human body. Even though He was God, He still took care of His human body and His spirit. He took care of His relationship with God by spending time alone and getting alone with God. So These are some of the principles that I look at in scripture that give me the reason for talking about self-care. And the purpose of self-care is not just about being selfish or just doing whatever you feel like. Instead, the purpose of it is about investing in and caring for the one life you've been given so that you can love God and love others. And you can also lead more effectively when you're doing this. Because if you're running on empty and you're resenting everything that you're doing, then you're not going to be effective as a leader. So what self-care is not? Let me give you 4 things that self-care is not. Self-care is not about doing whatever feels good at the moment. Self-care is not about focusing on yourself and what you want. Self-care is not about ignoring real issues or just leaning into distractions and things that might be fun and distract you from real pain. And self-care is not always easy. So I recognize right up here at the front of this episode that this term can come with some baggage and that there are various viewpoints on it. And I am not going to try and get into all the theological viewpoints on this topic. I will share a few links in the show notes to some articles that I found that were related to this topic. And if you want to dig deeper, I will share those there that you can check out. But I just wanted to start off by making sure that you understand that my goal for this episode for you is to help you move forward as a Christian woman leader so that you don't end up burnt out or completely unable to love and lead others. And it happens in ministry, it happens in work, all kinds of places. But we talked about this a little bit in episode 80 with Laura Howe. She shared about how this can very commonly happen in the context of ministry life. So, this is an episode for you as a female leader to simplify the way that you're looking at self-care as well as putting it into practice so that you can be a more effective leader. So in this episode, I want to give you 3 steps that you can implement in order to simplify your self-care. So the first step is to shift your mindset about self-care. So I think the first thing that we need to do is change the way that we're thinking about this issue of self-care. So I already kind of gave you some basics in terms of scripturally why I think it's a valid thing to do. But in this part of the conversation, I want to talk a little bit more about some other aspects of self-care that you might be thinking and you might need to change. Okay. So oftentimes I think women especially think I don't have time for self-care. It's a luxury or it's going to take too much time. Instead, I want you to change your mindset and look at self-care as stewardship and not as selfishness. So let's think about self-care as a way to be good stewards of what God has given us. Our bodies, our minds, our emotions, our time, our resources. These are the things that He has given to us. And if we steward them well, we will be able to lead better. So by taking time for self-care, you're telling God, thank you for giving me this body. Thank you for giving me my mind and my spirit. And I'm going to do my best to take care of it so that I can honor you. All right. So instead of thinking of it as a way of being selfish and just taking time for yourself to do whatever you want, look at it as stewardship. Another way to change your mindset about this is to think of self-care as restorative. So you want to make sure that you're looking at self-care as something that restores you instead of depletes you. So one of the things that self-care is often considered, a lot of people, I think, just think of self-care as something that is fun and easy to do. But oftentimes it's not easy, and it's actually something that is restorative and helps you to be a healthier version of yourself. So for me, it's not always easy to prioritize starting my day with quiet time with God, because my tendency and my personality is much more likely to just jump directly into work or other tasks. But I know that it's better for me and it restores me when I start my day with God or when I set aside time in my day to be with Him. Likewise, it's not easy, and I don't love spending time meal planning and grocery shopping and making healthy food. But I know that in the long run, it's actually better for me and my family when we do this. And so that's a way of looking at self-care as restorative and something that can be an investment into myself, into my family, into our future. Another way to change the mindset around self-care is to look at it as being proactive rather than reactive. So sometimes we wait until we are overwhelmed and stressed out, and that's when we decide to make self-care a priority. When you start to feel like you're going to break down at any moment, when you start snapping at your family, when you're struggling to get through the afternoon at work because you're just so exhausted, then you realize self-care has to happen. And usually what you think about is a week-long vacation in the Caribbean, a full day at the spa, or a weekend at home all to yourself with no one else around. That's if you're an introvert. If you're an extrovert, maybe you think about going away for the weekend with a group of friends. And to be honest, if you start feeling this way, that's when the unhealthy habits can start to creep in. Maybe you start eating more than you know you should. You snack all hours of the day, or you have that extra glass of wine, or you binge Netflix, and then you wonder where the last 5 hours went. When you're in reactive mode, your definition of self-care might get skewed, and it might turn into something that's doing more harm than good. So what I want you to try and do is to minimize the amount of times you start to feel that way. You start to look at being in reactive mode. And instead, I want you to shift to being proactive. Okay? So I want you to think about this. And if you're with me, just go ahead and nod your head or say yes. Can you agree that you are going to stop being reactive and instead be proactive about your self-care? All right. Awesome. What does this look like? So that's what I'm going to talk about next is in step 2, we are going to determine what self-care means to you. So this is where I think a lot of us fall into the trap of thinking that self-care has to be a certain prescribed formula. You have probably seen on the internet and read a lot of things, heard different episodes, podcast episodes about self-care. Maybe you've seen those lists on Pinterest with 50 things someone does in the morning before they start their day, and that's their self-care routine. And if that's you and that's what you do, awesome. More power to you. But here is what I have come to recognize over the past several years. What self-care is to me may not be self-care for you. So I think it's really important to figure out what is actually good for you. What's actually restorative for you? So let me give you an example. One of my top ways to incorporate self-care is to get outside. I love being out in nature. I love things like hiking and camping, whitewater rafting, sitting by the ocean. These are all things that fill me up. I am not as big of a fan of being outside in the winter when it's super cold, like it is right now, but in the summer, I love it. And even in the winter, I still do feel restored if I get outside and I go for a walk or I go snowshoeing or something like that. But to you, some of these things that I'm saying might not sound fun at all. You might hate hiking. You might not like really being in nature. So obviously, those things would not be on your list of self-care activities. So what I think is important here is that you brainstorm and make a list of the kinds of things that are self-care for you. As Laura Howe said back in episode 81, self-care can look very different for each person. And it doesn't have to be eating kale, doing yoga, and going to the gym. So I love that she said this, and it, just gave that kind of synopsis of what a stereotypical self-care routine might look like, but yours might be totally different, and that is fine. So I have a few tips for you on figuring out what your own self-care routine might want to be, okay? So the first tip is to be creative. In that same episode I just referred to, Laura shared that one of her ways of practicing self-care is to buy a roasted chicken at the grocery store each week. This means she doesn't have to cook dinner that night. It's a simple thing, but it reduces her stress and just takes a little bit off of her plate for that night. So you have to try and move away from the idea that self-care has to mean a massage or a weekend away. Get creative with what it might be for you. Perhaps it's lighting a candle while reading a book before you go to bed. Maybe it's listening to your favorite music and dancing in the kitchen with your kids while you're making dinner. It could be any number of things, but you want to just kind of think outside of the box in terms of what these things could be for you. All right, another tip is to get back to what you love. If you're still struggling with making your list, start thinking back to what were the things that you loved when you were a kid. For me, I spent a lot of time in the winter months ice skating with friends. And we lived in a small town and we had this spot where we could go and skate outdoors. And it was a regular activity for me. And as an adult, I kind of got away from ice skating. I stopped going and I just, sort of forgot about it. But I knew that I still loved it. And so in the recent years, I have gotten back into the routine of going ice skating. There's a local rink and some friends of mine and I meet up and we try to go once a week right now. So it's a really fun activity for me. It fills me up. It's also exercise, so that's good for me too. And it's something that I enjoy. So think back to what you used to love doing as a kid that maybe you haven't allowed yourself to do as an adult. Maybe it's coloring or drawing. Maybe it's making necklaces, writing, playing basketball, anything, cooking. The point is to get back to some of the basics of things that really are fun for us, that fill us up, and that maybe you just forgot that were something that you enjoyed doing. So in the end, if we make time for these things, we're going to be healthier and we're going to be better able to manage our other responsibilities. So I want you to just think outside of the box, go back to when you were a kid and think about what you used to love. All right, next, another tip, if you're still needing help with figuring out what could be on your list, take a minute and dream a little. All right. Maybe all the things I'm talking about here have you rolling your eyes at me. You can't possibly imagine doing any of the things I've shared, at least not on a regular basis. So what I want you to do is simply dream a little. Let go of what you know your current reality is and start dreaming. What would you love to do if you had an afternoon free? I realize that right now, maybe you can't think of having an afternoon free, but if you did, what would it look like? What would you do? What would you do if you could set up your ideal schedule for an entire week? Maybe the only thing you can think of to do if you have an afternoon free is take a nap. But if you had a whole week where you could have your ideal schedule, what would it look like? And just dream about what that would be. Now, I know that it's possible you're not going to actually be able to do this right now, but I want you to maybe dream about it and write it down. And if you still need help brainstorming and thinking this through, I want to let you know that I have something that I created several years ago, actually, called a Personal Wellness Worksheet. It's not that exciting of a title, but it will help you brainstorm and come up with some ways to de-stress. So it's not necessarily 100% about self-care, but it is about finding ways to de-stress. And it also helps you to figure out a personal wellness habit that you would like to incorporate into your life. And again, you could just rename that and call that a self-care habit. Now, if you're inside of the Confident Leader Club, you already have access to this. But if you are not there, you can grab this free download. You can go to the show notes for this episode, estherlittlefield.com/episode 87. Okay, and I'll put a button right there where you can put your name and email in and get that sent to your email. So this is some of the ways that I recommend brainstorming this list of ideas for self-care. Because again, you want to make a list that's going to be things that you actually enjoy, that are restorative to you, that are fun, and that are going to actually fill you up. Okay, so once you make your list of ideas, maybe you have 5 to 10 ideas, I want you to try and narrow down to a few of those things that you would like to do maybe on a daily basis or on a weekly basis. This is again about doing what works for you, but also what's going to be healthy and helpful for you in the long run. So when you're choosing your activity, ask yourself whether that thing fills you up or drains you. And that will help you to determine what activities to select. So again, this is going to be different for everybody, and you want to be thinking about things that are practical that you could actually implement right now. So if on your list is, having a weekly massage, but that's not in the budget right now, then you might need to put that on the future, the future goals list, but it might not be something you can actually implement right now. All right. So the third step to simplifying your self-care is to make a plan to incorporate self-care regularly. So you've already decided to be proactive and you've made your list of several things that will fill you up. So this last step is basically to figure out, when are you going to make this happen? And we talked about in episode 85, you have to make a plan or things are just not going to happen. It's not going to just magically happen that you're going to have this new self-care routine in place. It takes being intentional, but I promise that it's worth it. So here are a couple ways where you can actually make it happen. And I'm trying to keep it simple so that this doesn't feel overwhelming and hard. All right, so the first thing is to look at your schedule and eliminate the clutter. And I know you've heard me say this before, but look at your schedule and honestly ask yourself if there are things in there that do not need to be there. Are you wasting time on things that are not necessary, that you don't actually need to do? If so, then get rid of them. Here's a quick and easy example. One simple way that I have cut down the amount of time that I'm out of my house is by ordering my groceries online. So rather than spending time in the grocery store picking everything up, I order them online, I drive up, they bring them to my car. There is a small fee involved, but for me, it's totally worth it. So that saves me some time and it gives me time for other things. This also helps me to be intentional with meal planning, like I mentioned earlier, because I don't just wander around the store grabbing whatever I see, and I'm much more intentional about making my meal plan when I order my groceries. So that helps. And then I also am spending less time at the grocery store or Target, so I'm spending less money as well. So what is something you can eliminate? Another little tip here is, looking at how much time you're spending on your phone. And if you listened to episode 86 with Alyssa Watts, you heard Alyssa share about her journey and about some of the things she's learned about simplifying her life, but specifically about taking time away from social media. And that may or may not be practical for all of us, but it may be something that you want to consider, that you could actually spend less time on social media and instead you could use that time for something that would actually be restorative and healthy for you. So first is eliminating the clutter from your schedule. And then the second thing is identify when you will incorporate the new self-care practices. All right, so first we're going to eliminate and then we're going to add. So now you've got this idea of a new practice that you want to incorporate into your schedule. And I mentioned before trying to pick one thing that would be a daily habit and one that would be a weekly habit. So just as an example for me, one of my daily habits that's part of what I consider my self-care is my time with God. That is something I want to do daily because it's caring for my spiritual wellness. It's not always easy, but I know that it actually benefits me and helps me to be healthier. It helps me to stay in a much better frame of mind during the day. Another daily thing that I want to be working on is writing. I recognized a while ago that writing is a self-care habit for me. I love writing, and so it can be journaling, it can be writing a blog post, it could be preparing for a podcast episode, but writing fills me up. And I was getting really hung up on the idea of Sabbath, and I was telling myself that I couldn't write on the days that I was taking the Sabbath because I didn't want to work on those days. But when I recognized that actually writing is a form of self-care for me and that it's a way to fill up my soul, and actually a lot of times it's a way that I communicate with God, I realized that that was actually something that I should allow myself to do on those days and not cut myself off from the writing. So I know that this is one of those daily habits that I'm working on implementing. I don't always write every day right now, but that's something that I'm working on. All right. Now let's shift to the weekly thing. How are you going to incorporate a new weekly habit? It could be, again, as simple as what Laura talked about, picking up the roasted chicken, or maybe it's going on a date night with your husband or going out with your girlfriends for a girls' night. Maybe it's allowing yourself to just watch a particular show on Netflix or on TV. It could be something that is, again, one of those ideas that you wrote down on your list, but it's once a week and you're putting it on your schedule as part of your routine. Okay? Now, I know what you're going to say. You can't do this because you can't fit one more thing into your schedule. But that is precisely why you have to do this, my friend. If you are so jam-packed that you have no time to do some of these simple things, then there is a problem. And again, many of these activities do not have to take a long time. You can incorporate self-care into what you're already doing. You don't have to think about it as a totally separate part of your schedule. It might be sometimes something separate, like when I go ice skating with my friends, yes, I have to leave my house, I have to go meet them. But in many cases, your routines, your self-care habits can be incorporated with something you're already doing. Okay? I'm not getting into all the ways of developing habits. I'll put a link in the show notes for some of the resources we have, some of the past episodes about habits and some of the blog posts I have written about that. But those are my thoughts for you today on simplifying self-care. And I want to just recap what I've shared because, again, I don't want you to walk away from this episode feeling more overwhelmed than you did when you started listening. But I think that you can really take this step by step and simplify it and get it into your routine so that you can operate as a more healthy leader, a healthier woman, and be ready to serve God and serve others more effectively. All right, so the first thing is to shift your mindset about self-care by believing that self-care is stewardship, that it's restorative, and that it's better to be proactive rather than reactive. Secondly, you're going to figure out what self-care means to you and come up with your list of things that you would consider to be self-care. And it doesn't have to look like any of the lists on Pinterest or my list or anything that takes up a lot of time or money. Lastly, you're going to get self-care into your regular routine by putting it in your schedule. First, you're going to subtract anything out of your schedule that isn't 100% necessary, and then you're going to add in some time for self-care. And this could be 5 to 10 minutes a day. It could be as simple as on the drive to work, you are turning off the radio and you're praying. Okay? That could be something that you incorporate into your day, that you're just eliminating the noise of the world around you and you're focusing in on God. It could be 1 hour on the weekend when you ask your husband to be the point person so that you can go out for a walk or write or go with a friend for coffee. All right? Keep it simple. Now, I want to hear how you're going to put this episode into action. So in our Facebook group this week, I want you to come on over, come find the post about this episode in our group and tell me what steps you're going to take to get self-care going in your routine. Some of you are already doing it and you're doing amazing. Others of us have a little further to go. So I can't wait to hear how you're going to start incorporating self-care and simplifying it so that it can be a regular part of your life. All right, come back next week for the next episode in our Simplify series. I'll talk to you then. Thanks for joining us on the Christian Women Leadership Podcast. If you enjoyed this conversation, come and join us in our private Facebook community. We would love to get to know you better so that we can make sure the podcast is providing what you need. Plus, you can share your questions and ideas, and you'll be surrounded by incredible Christian women leaders. To join the group, visit estherlittlefield.com/group. Now, don't forget, your leadership matters, and it's time for you to embrace your gifts and lead with confidence.